Character of the week. So, happy Halloween, everybody. Today's Character Week segment is dedicated to one of my favorite subgenres of horror, the slasher flick, which is also indicative of today's holiday because 1978, John Carpenter's Halloween was one of the very first slasher flicks. Now, if you look throughout cinematic history, you'll see that there were footprints laid the foundation for slasher flicks as we know nowadays. 1923, the horror film called The Bat, and 1940s, there was one called The Leopard Man. They pretty much paved way for the masked antagonist to murder everybody. And of course, we gotta give a shout out to the godmother of slasher flicks, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. Yeah, that infamous scene. And then you have the Italian Giallo films, which was pretty much like the creative murder of franchise. So all this is actually what paved the way for John Carpenter to take all these aspects of it. So if you think about what slasher flicks are, it's a combination of all these things. You got the murder mystery element, you have the survival horror element, you have the creative deaths of the Giallo films element, you have the mask antagonist element, and of course mix all that with the punk rock grindhouse filmmaking style, low budget. You got yourself a nice genre of slasher flicks, which is where John Carpenter's Halloween kicked in the door. Then you have subsequent, I won't say a carbon copy of it, but then you have Friday the 13th, which on the surface does look like it's a copy of Halloween. But in reality, both these films helped solidify what became a franchise staple amongst slasher flicks, The Rules. The surprisingly conservative nature of slasher flicks, despite all the gore, like the purity over promiscuity. Sex equals death. Drugs and fun and teen inhibitions also equal death. Pranksters cry wolf or lie too many times, you find yourself, no one believes you when you actually are dying. Such rules became a staple, like I said, among slasher flicks. Between like the 80s and say 80, 83, 84, there started becoming a decline in the interest in slasher flicks. You know, been there, done that, we've seen it all. Thanks to Wes Craven, Nightmare on Elm Street. This now adds a supernatural element to the slasher flicks. You got the creative deaths, can't get more creative than how Freddy Krueger killed most of his characters. Speaking of Freddy Krueger, by all counts, is a horrible, horrible individual. He murders children. They put him on lunchboxes. Like I said, because of Freddy Krueger and the supernatural element in the quippy, you started adding more of the element of the antagonist being the star of the show. Freddy Krueger, then you had Child's Play with Chucky, the Leprechaun from The Leprechaun. I will never, ever forgive you for Leprechaun in the Hood. Speaking of Hood, you also had Candyman, which added another blaxploitation element to the horror slasher flicks. So, as you're starting to notice, there's ebb and flows with the slasher flicks franchise. By the 90s, mid-90s, there started to be a decline in slasher flicks. Well, Wes Craven, once again, saves the franchise with Scream, which is ultimately a parody of the rules and the regulations of most of the subsets of the slasher flicks. That pretty much turns most of the rules on the head, especially with the fact that, you know, Sid wasn't a virgin and she still survived. She did live up to the final girl trope, which is like ultimately the protagonist being female and surviving despite all the odds and trauma bonding. So along with the Scream franchise, you also have several copycats that followed along with it. I Know What You Did Last Summer, It Follows, Jennifer's Body, Cabin in the Woods, Final Destination. All these films that followed the formula of like that teen slasher revamp that happened because of Scream. Like I said, when it started becoming a decline, they used another element that added to the slasher flicks: torture porn, Saw, Cube, you know, things like that. So all in all, the heyday of slashers was in the 80s, but its continuation and its legacy lasts to this day. So shouts out to you. Cheers to the slasher flicks. Now, yo, what was that sound? I'll be right back. Like, share, subscribe.